Okay, welcome back. So we're going to take a look at part two of compositional studies using gesture and action. So I've got a reproduction here of Rembrandt, and we've got a fairly complex composition. And the first thing I want to show you is the analysis of the very basic formulation of the composition, and then we'll go into and spend some more time doing a sustained sketch that builds off of just this first direction. So I'll use in this first part of the demonstration a little bit of color here to render out the basic flow or movement. There we go, get the cursor going. So what we see here in Rembrandt's composition is this beginning movement in this direction, this flow through, almost like a sweep up. So we're coming down through this way, right? And he brings us through tone in value or light and dark relationships, this curve here in the atmosphere. Atmosphere can be a real powerful way to show flow and movement and give us the focal point and to show us only the detail in the areas of light. Rembrandt was a master in many ways, and one of those was to show us the detail in the lightest areas and then give us just very little information in the darks. It's a very, this image is very much a great example of chiaroscuro in your studies. So keep that in mind. So we end, the initial flow of the composition ends in this way, where it's like a wave. So you notice, you see the dark pattern coming from this flow here and around, right? And then we move through, and it takes us to what will be our beginning aspect of our figures, which is an anatomy lesson here. So we have what's essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 plus the cadaver, 9. A 9-figure composition, and the main action happens slightly in center through here, right? Through this area, and then slightly off center as they're intently watching the master anatomist do his medical work. So I might start by analyzing this composition with the flow of the figures in this direction with the heads, and wind up with the main character, the doctor's head, which would be right in this, certainly in this direction. So the flow of heads would be obviously in through here, and they're obviously leaning over and very intent as to the activity of their professor or of their teacher and through here. So we can kind of locate all these heads and all these figures in this direction as they're looking down. Of course, the cadaver sits and is tucked inside, so its head is pushed back somewhat because the action starts at the forearm of the composition, and we move the figure back this way. Not all of the figure is lit, only the parts that of the torso, not even the entire head, part of the head and the most of the torso is lit, to really signify a pretty interesting way to give us a focal point. And the figure begins as it falls out of the composition into the ending part of the back end of this composition and through here in terms of analysis and through there. I'm not sure exactly what this part is, but because it's so dark. But we get the idea that, again, this rhythmic flow through the composition, and then almost like an ocean wave, if you will, and then the major figuration of the composition happens inside of that ocular kind of eye, if you will, which is a pretty interesting idea too as well. So we have that head, that figure. which will be located there, and then this very far back figure as they begin to become stacked up. So in their case, they move from, kind of in this direction and then over and through. And so there's almost kind of a little triangle of where they all flow through in that direction. The two middle figures are there as well. All right, so now we have our composition generally sort of analyzed in its most, what I would call its most diagrammatic or simplest form, kind of like, well, just like I showed you in the video prior, the lesson prior to this one. Now let's take it a little bit further. We can go a little bit deeper and zoom in a little bit and draw and slow down just a little bit. So maybe that's too far. Again, with this particular lesson, we don't want to get too terribly bogged down in every single compositional detail. I want you to keep that in mind. But I do want to give it more structure, and I do want to give it more clarity, and I do want to make it also tonal so that you see where you can take these into their understanding and their kind of conclusion. So if you keep that in mind, if you can learn to keep this very, very simple and compositionally basic, you can get to quite a bit of complexity pretty quickly. And again, the main point is to use this idea of gesture and action in to keep this loose and free and very basic. All right, so I'm going to start in here mapping out a little bit more of the head and the neck and the beard and through here in the hat, which sort of kind of disappears into the atmosphere of the composition and through here. Working on the shoulder a little bit, outlining the gesture into here. So for these, I keep actually a relatively thick nib tip in this Wacom tablet because I don't need to noodle in all of the details of this gesture. Matter of fact, I could go for an even thicker tip, which would keep it really, really tonal, but I do want to get the major kind of compositional structure in line, and then I'll use tone later on. So we want to do about a 25-minute study, which is more of a sustained gesture. It's not a 3-hour, 3-day sketch. So, feeling again this flow as I move the cursor around is, notice this detail back here, which looks like some kind of medical pamphlet or piece of paper, which probably has detailed anatomical instructions. Notice that it's just not laid there, flat across like this, but it's given a movement, right? It's given a direction. This curvature here is really important, this back flow. So we come in through here of this form. This kind of piece of part of the table or chair. And so we have that. So that emphasizes the curvature already going this way. So that I have the arrows going in, we could sweep in, or you can read a composition just the opposite way. What's important is that flow, that movement, which helps quite a bit. So I'll come down here and let's get more of the arms positioned in the hand. So we'll just indicate the little gesture of the tool being used in through here. And we'll start to Begin to just gesture in the cadaver. The rib cage in through here. So the cadaver is interesting. He sets off the cadaver as part of the focal point, but the contrast is not as intense on most of the cadaver. The skin tone is decidedly of a greenish gray hue, and so that already darkens the cadaver up to make it less contrasty, to contrast against the warm, alive tones, if you will, the flesh of the medical students. And then we have a little bit of the leg coming down. Of course, they fade off a little bit. So I'll finish that part in. We have a little bit of that medical anatomical exposed flesh opened up there. So, and yes, cadavers were used in the Baroque era, in Rembrandt's time, not only certainly for medical school study, but also for artistic study, the study of artistic anatomy, and what makes the anatomical forms that we draw what they are important now and were back then. They weren't always important. Certainly in the Middle Ages they were not as important. Okay, so I've got the thrust of the cadaver in, and so let's start to feel our way, think our way through the drawing of the rest of the composition here. So I'm always thinking about, you know, my lines here, this flow. Put down this table a little bit. This flow this way, right? And so then he starts to move back up the composition this way, this turn into here, and we come up to what's going to be the head of this medical student over here, running through here. So his head is again placed in profile from the side. And we've got him primarily cropped here. There might be another. Whoops, I did miss that part. So we could put him a little closer in through here. No need to erase, we'll just draw right over. So just keep that in mind with these. They're really meant to be exercises and not perfection, so I'm not going to worry about going back and erasing over that. There's no point. Mistakes can be fun to look at, and they can set you free a little bit. So these two figures are jammed close together, so we have another student here, right, and he gets pretty much bumped up against the edge of the picture plane here. So we have these two kind of almost mirror images of each other, and so this one overlaps a little bit of that one, but they both have the feel and flow coming back this way, right? So there's not a lot of detail in this darkness. There's not a lot of detail in this shadow. All the detail is left for the heads and for part of the cadaver in light. So this person's arm, hand is about right in through there, and then we kind of fade out in through here. So we can imagine a fairly dimly lit room, and we can imagine maybe candles in the background because there was no electricity, or maybe perhaps a lantern somehow that was lit for these figures. So then our next figure will push over, and notice how, again, these heads, this is something you want to think about when you're studying, analyzing your drawings and your compositions, is notice how these heads are pretty much in alignment straight, but then they start to, this one here subtly arches up, which continues this flow of shadow in dark this way. That's important to get that, to make sure that when you do your studies from whatever images that you want to use, is that you try to, when you get, especially when you get something sustained, right, you take a little bit more time to worry about the subtleties of placement. I know I said earlier, sometimes I'm not as worried, and I'm not when it's really big picture analysis, like just the sweep of the composition up here, right? But later on, when I get more time, when I want to spend more time with it, I do belabor the placement of the heads in relationship to the flow, because I get this straight line and I get this curve coming up, which is going to be important. It's going to set me off against this dark. So he places this figure's body in a way that sets off the other figure's head in terms of the composition through here. So we have this figure's head. He comes down. There's a kind of a darkness in through here with their clothing. Their clothing is already kind of dark. It reminds of what we call our American pilgrims of that time. We have the clothing and style of that day, very formal. And then we have these figures coming downward here. All right. So now we have let's push in this head over here, which is a little higher through here. Through here, so notice this figure, he's a little higher than this figure. We have the hat that sets off this figure compositionally, which makes him a little bit more important. All right, so we have this movement with the head slightly tilted downward, just to give us a movement or feeling of that rhythm, that flow. Again, this way, right? So we have this figure now. This figure, it feels like an internal flow. So everything is wrapped around light this way, right? So we're feeling this coming down in terms of light this way. And so these two figures are kind of in the center of this compositional vortex. These two figures here, and they're kind of in that more of the eye of the storm, if you would, in through here. So we'll kind of map in this head. We're looking slightly down on this head into here. So I just kind of indicate with these heads, I try to find just an oval, right? And this is kind of the top plane of the head, the side plane, and just the shadows of the line of the eye and the nose, center line. And that's all I need for something so small and not meant to be very, very detailed at all. Even though I'm taking more pains to be, relatively more accurate with placement. But again, this is still relatively a sustained thumbnail sketch. So we'll move this figure over here, like so. And then we'll focus on the last figure over here before we start to tone this drawing down a little bit. So this placement's a little higher. Of course, he's further back in the composition, further away from us. And that means he's least important. And he's also slightly smaller than in terms of the other figures and scale of the head. But it does make a sort of apex to the top of this triangle through there. So we put on his top part of his dress wear there. and he's got his arm and hand in through there. Okay, so let's pull out just a little bit and see what we have thus far. All right, so compositionally, it's really active in center top left, kind of in this first quadrant of the composition. If we have this diagram again, and if we split it right down the middle vertically and horizontally, it's really active here on over. So this entire area is really active, and the rest of it from here on over, right, is pretty dark. It's in a darkened room. All right, so let's play off that now. So let's bump this up a little bit, and let's take our tip and go a little darker, and let's judge our size. That's probably a nice scale. And we'll go a little darker, and we'll start to add some tone and value to this a little bit and see what we can start to play off of here. So I'll be a little bit more careful than the other ones. So again, this whole idea of this vortex, and we'll go back and we'll add layers of darkness. I'm thinking about the whole thing, and we'll take it in waves and stanzas, if you will. His hat through here. So I've got a pretty blunt tool because I want to be very, very broad. I can even go broader back in here since it's already so broad. There's nothing back here. It's just the room, the darkness of the room, and so it's pretty empty. He sets that off really nicely by emptying out all of this here. And look how the cadaver gets cut off. We know the cadaver continues in the background, but we see through Rembrandt's vision that most of it is now in shadow. So we have that in shadow here, right? And so we'll come around our vortex that we're noticing, and we'll start to bring this up. Here, the darkness of the atmosphere as it mixes with the clothing of these two front figures. Okay, so it's a pretty broad stroke I'm using. All right, so now let's pop in, get a little closer, and go with the smaller tip here. And I just vary my tip according to visually what it looks like. It's nothing I'm doing that's really special. So let's go a little bit more individually here, and we'll tackle the head and the hat in through here. And the cloth of the person's outfit, the anatomist. Your outfit, keep that very simple and basic. And we'll come back here and we'll darken that in a little bit later. Hit that cadaver. And so I'm using tone now to parlay the compositional flow and direction that Rembrandt set us on. And through here with the hand. We'll capture this area. Notice how he takes the dark area again of this figure's backdrop in contrast against the forehead and head area of this figure. So this is something when you do master studies that you will, the best way to learn from them is copy from them, analyze them actually for their compositional quality, not necessarily, we're not even talking about style, and style really isn't in the picture here. We're talking about in relating design and structure and compositional flow and movement. That's more important to us for this purpose than any kind of artistic style. So we're not copying a style, we're analyzing the various compositional structural components that Rembrandt made to put this all together. So we have that. We have the back of the head through here. Okay, it'll start to get dark in a moment. We can make this nib go a little wider, so we can start to fill up this flow again. So I'm just building up the tone, and I'm separating the composition really into a darker side and a lighter side. Into what is, a fairly complex composition, but we're simplifying this. So we'll come down here. Into this range. Kind of wash over the cadaver a little bit. Back in this area. And we'll come through over here. We push this over. So still a pretty thick nib. To get the wave kind of crescendoing over in this way. And we'll start to put some tone back here. It's not as dark. Remember, they're in a pretty dark room, and they're lit by what is probably lantern at this time, or candlelight. So we have that emerging through. So now we're getting a pretty good sense of the composition that is emerging in our study, in our design, in our look and feel of what is Rembrandt actually doing with composition, not only structurally, but in this case with gesture and in tone. It's like using the side of a pencil or charcoal pencil, really, in this set. Not quite as dark back there. And then if you wanted to, with the Wacom tablet, you can, the cool thing is you can kind of go in really close. And maybe I'll just kind of tool around with just the heads of these, our little figures, and of course it gets pretty pixelated, so. Just to give it a little bit more oomph, a little tightness, but it's not really the point, but you'll get to see a little bit more. It's kind of like using a pretty tiny line. I wanted to go further, maybe at 2. Gives you a little line in through there. Maybe makes it tightens things up a little bit. And so on. So I think you get the idea here of what's happening. All right, let's step back and look and see what we have. So we analyzed through the red marks here. Let me go back and make this clean and clear. Again, this first wave, right? This wave and flow that this composition brings us. It's pretty dramatic and unique. He really moves us in, again, this direction. And we flow up and around right through here. And then again, like a tidal wave, we come in and then around, right? And then this beautiful movement here, which is kind of a triangle. Did we get that in through here? I think we did. We flow up through here, up and around and over. And so these seem like they're on a straight line, but do you see how this flow from head 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is actually an arc. It's the other side of the wave, right, coming up, which is here. In here, even this where it gets a little darker tells us too, and right in through here. So all of this is important to Rembrandt, and of course the main action happens right where my cursor is through there. So that gives you a great sense of what he can do, and what we can analyze from that using just simple gesture, action. The most simplest parts of the analysis of the composition, which is more of just an abstract diagram of just arrows and movements, and then fleshing out, put our figures on top of that, and then using a little tonality, which is really, we only have about 3 values, the darkest dark, a medium, and a light, to analyze what is a 10-person composition. Okay, so I hope you got something out of it. Certainly feel free to email me, let me know how you're doing, and there'll be lots of more videos to come. So keep at it, stay tuned, keep practicing. That's the biggest thing to remember, is to keep on keeping on with these. And with that, I will see you next time. Take care.